The last thing Jeremiah Holloway heard before his world changed forever was the sound of three children speaking in perfect unison. But the words they spoke belonged to no living language on earth. Their voices drifted through the morning mist that clung to the Georgia pines like ancient secrets, carrying syllables that scholars would later identify as a dialect that had been dead for over 1,000 years. This is the story of three children who remembered things they had never learned, spoke words they had never heard, and knew truths that would shatter everything their community believed about life, death, and what lies between. The red clay hills of Rabun County stretched like scars across northeastern Georgia in 1852, where the sound of axes biting into virgin timber echoed through valleys thick with Cherokee rose and mountain laurel. The texture of life here was carved from granite and determination, shaped by winters that tested faith and summers that burned away the weak. Jeremiah Holloway had chosen his homestead for reasons that made sense to a man who valued solitude over society, building his cabin 3 miles up Sweetwater Creek, where the only sounds were wind through longleaf pines and the distant cry of red-tailed hawks circling overhead. Before we descend deeper into this tale of children who should not have existed, take a moment to let us know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If this story grips you like morning fog clings to mountain ridges, hit that like button and subscribe to Ancestral Fear, because some family mysteries were meant to stay buried in the red Georgia earth. By 1852, Jeremiah had lived alone for 8 years, content with his isolation and the rhythms of frontier life that demanded everything but promised nothing in return. His nearest neighbors, the Mackenzie family, lived 4 miles downstream where Sweetwater Creek bent around a natural meadow that caught the morning sun like a cupped hand holding liquid gold. Between Jeremiah and the Mackenzies lay nothing but wilderness, game trails, and the kind of silence that made a man hear his own heartbeat. Then came the night that changed everything. October 13th, 1852, when autumn had painted the hillsides in shades of fire and the first frost had touched the valley floors with crystal fingers. Jeremiah woke to the sound of children laughing, a sound so out of place in his isolated world that he initially mistook it for the cry of night birds, or perhaps the distant howl of wolves. But as consciousness fully claimed him, he realized the sounds were unmistakably human. 3 young voices speaking in animated conversation somewhere near his cabin. The impossibility of children being in his remote location at midnight sent Jeremiah reaching for the rifle that never left his bedside. He'd lived on the frontier long enough to know that sounds in the darkness could mean raiders, thieves, or worse. But when he stepped onto his porch, lantern held high against the October cold, what he saw defied every assumption he'd made about isolation and impossible visitors. 3 children sat in his yard, appearing to be perhaps 6 years old, identical in every detail except for the color of their simple cloth dresses. One wore white, one wore gray, one wore black. Their hair fell in perfect golden curls to their shoulders. Their skin held the pale luminescence of children who had never known hard labor under the Georgia sun, and their eyes reflected his lantern, light with an intensity that belonged to nocturnal creatures rather than human youngsters. They looked up at his approach with no fear, no surprise, no recognition that their presence required explanation. Instead, they resumed their conversation, speaking in a language that sounded vaguely familiar but remained completely incomprehensible. The rhythm of their words carried the cadence of English, but the syllables belonged to something older, something that touched memories he didn't know he possessed. "Who are you?" Jeremiah called, his voice echoing off the surrounding hills. "Where do you come from?" The children looked at each other, seemed to reach some silent agreement, and the one in white stood up. When she spoke, her words came in perfect, unaccented English that seemed to emerge from a throat too small to produce such clear articulation. "We are the Holloway children, sir. We have been waiting for you to wake up." The name hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. Holloway had been his family name before he'd fled west from South Carolina, before he'd abandoned everything connected to his previous life, before he'd sworn never to speak of the tragedy that had driven him into the wilderness. But these children couldn't know that name. No one in Georgia knew his history. "There are no Holloway children," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The child in gray stood next, her expression carrying a gravity that belonged on the face of someone much older. "There are now, Father. We have been looking for you for a very long time." Some encounters crack reality like ice under sudden pressure. What followed would challenge every assumption Jeremiah had made about the nature of existence itself, beginning with his discovery that these children knew details about his past that no living person could possibly know, and ending with the realization that some family connections transcend the boundaries between life and death. The children's knowledge proved unnervingly specific. They knew about the fire that had claimed his wife and 3 unborn children in Charleston. They knew about the guilt that had driven him west, the nightmares that still woke him screaming, the letters he'd written but never sent to family members, who assumed he'd died in the same blaze that destroyed his previous life. Most disturbing, they knew about the promises he'd made to children who had never drawn breath, vows spoken in grief that no one else had witnessed. "You promised us names," said the child in black, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone accustomed to being ignored. "Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary. You promised us stories and songs and bedtime prayers. You promised us a father's love even though we never lived to receive it." The names were correct. During the darkest nights following the fire, Jeremiah had indeed spoken to the children his wife had carried, children who had died with her when their Charleston home became an inferno. In his grief, he had given them names, spoken to them as if they could hear him, promised them the childhood they would never have. But these conversations had been private, desperate attempts to maintain connection with loss too profound to bear. "You're not real," Jeremiah said, though his conviction wavered as the children smiled with expressions that mixed infinite patience with genuine affection. "Reality takes many forms in these mountains," replied the child in white. "We are as real as grief, as substantial as memory, as present as love that refuses to die with the body." Over the following weeks, the children became a constant presence in Jeremiah's isolated world. They appeared at dawn, sitting in his yard as if they had materialized from the morning mist. They vanished at sunset, fading into the gathering darkness, like shadows that had lost their attachment to solid objects. During the daylight hours between these appearances and disappearances, they displayed behaviors that convinced Jeremiah he was either losing his sanity or witnessing something that challenged the fundamental nature of reality itself. The children aged, but not in any recognizable pattern. Some days they appeared as infants, crawling through his yard while babbling in that strange language that seemed to predate human speech. Other days they manifested as adolescents, their conversations revealing knowledge about topics no children should understand. Most unsettling were the days when they appeared as adults, speaking with voices of authority about subjects that belonged to scholars, theologians, and philosophers. But their most disturbing characteristic was their language. While they could speak perfect English when addressing Jeremiah directly, their conversations among themselves occurred in syllables that belonged to no living tongue. When Jeremiah asked about their strange speech, the child in gray provided an explanation that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. "We speak the first language, Father. The words that existed before words, the sounds that shaped meaning before meaning took form. We remember what has been forgotten, know what has been lost, speak what has been silenced." Dr. Mordecai Blackwood, a traveling scholar who passed through Rabun County in November 1852, became the first outsider to encounter the Holloway children. His initial skepticism transformed into fascination when he realized their archaic speech patterns matched linguistic reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European, a theoretical language that scholars believed had existed thousands of years before recorded history. According to Blackwood's journal, the children spoke fluently in a dialect that represented the root of all European languages, demonstrating pronunciation and grammatical structures that existed only in academic theory. But the children's linguistic abilities extended beyond ancient speech patterns. They seemed to understand every language Blackwood tested, responding appropriately to questions posed in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and several Native American dialects. More disturbing, they corrected his pronunciation of dead languages, suggesting that his scholarly reconstructions were flawed approximations of how these tongues had actually sounded when spoken by living populations. These children possess knowledge that cannot be acquired through conventional learning, Blackwood wrote in a letter to the American Antiquarian Society. They speak languages that died out millennia before their birth with the fluency of native speakers. Either they represent some unprecedented form of genetic memory, or they have access to information sources that transcend normal human experience. The scholar's presence attracted attention from other visitors, drawn by reports of children who spoke in tongues that belonged to ancient civilizations. Reverend Elias Thornfield arrived from Savannah to investigate what he initially assumed were cases of religious possession requiring exorcism. Professor Jonathan Hartwell traveled from the University of Georgia to document what he believed might be evidence of inherited memory transmitted through bloodlines. Dr. Sebastian Morse came from Charleston to study what he theorized could be evidence of reincarnation, souls returning with memories intact from previous incarnations. Each investigator arrived with theories that the children systematically demolished through demonstrations that exceeded every hypothesis about their abilities. They didn't speak ancient languages imperfectly like someone who had learned them from books. They spoke them with the casual fluency of children who had grown up hearing these tongues in daily conversation. They corrected scholarly translations, provided cultural context that wasn't available in written records, and sang lullabies in languages that had been extinct since before the Roman Empire. The truth about what families become when death refuses To accept its limitations would prove more disturbing than any scholarly theory could encompass. The children weren't just speaking dead languages. They were channeling the voices of civilizations that had vanished from human memory, serving as conduits for knowledge that had been lost when entire cultures disappeared from the historical record. But their most unsettling revelation came when Jeremiah asked them directly about their origin. The answer would challenge everything he believed about the relationship between the living and the dead, forcing him to confront the possibility that his grief had somehow created a bridge between worlds that should remain forever separate. "We are the children you loved before we were born," explained the child in white, her words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "We are the family you mourned before we could disappoint you. We are the perfect versions of what might have been, preserved in the amber of unfulfilled hope." The child in gray continued the explanation with clinical precision that belonged to someone much older. "Grief creates its own reality, Father. Love denied expression finds other outlets. The children who died with Mother in Charleston never had the opportunity to become real. So we became real in the only way available to us, through your need for us to exist." The child in black provided the final piece of understanding that would haunt Jeremiah for the remainder of his life. "We are not ghosts of children who lived and died. We are the living embodiment of children who never had the chance to live. Your love gave us form, your isolation gave us space to exist, and your grief gave us purpose. Some manifestations exceed the boundaries of supernatural visitation, entering territory where psychology, metaphysics, and human need intersect in ways that create new forms of reality. The Holloway children represented something unprecedented in documented cases of spiritual phenomena. Not spirits of the deceased returning to communicate with the living, but unborn souls called into existence by parental love so powerful it could transcend the barriers between potential and actual existence. Dr. Blackwood's extended study of the children revealed additional disturbing aspects of their nature. They possessed perfect knowledge of events that had occurred throughout history, but only events that had been witnessed by children. They could describe in vivid detail what it felt like to experience the fall of Rome from a child's perspective, the burning of the Library of Alexandria as seen through young eyes, the construction of Stonehenge as remembered by children who had watched their parents move the massive stones. They seemed to have access to a collective memory of childhood experiences spanning millennia, Blackwood wrote, as if every child who had ever lived had contributed their memories to a shared repository that these entities can access at will. They know what children throughout history have seen, felt, feared, and hoped. The children's knowledge extended to personal histories as well. When visitors came to investigate their phenomena, the children could describe their childhood experiences with accuracy that exceeded what the visitors remembered themselves. They knew about forgotten toys, childhood friends, family secrets, traumatic events that had been suppressed for decades. Mrs. Adelaide Fairfax, a Charleston socialite who came to debunk what she assumed were fraudulent claims, fled the Holloway homestead after the children described in perfect detail the sexual abuse she had suffered at the hands of her uncle when she was 8 years old, events she had never told anyone and had tried desperately to forget. They know every secret shame, every childhood trauma, every moment of innocent joy that adults have buried beneath years of accumulated experience, she wrote to her sister. They see through the masks we wear to hide our damaged inner children, speaking to the parts of ourselves we've learned to deny. But the most disturbing aspect of the children's knowledge was their understanding of how childhood experiences shaped adult behavior. They could predict with uncanny accuracy how visitors would respond to specific stimuli, what fears would paralyze them, what hopes would motivate them, what memories would break their emotional defenses. Professor Hartwell discovered this during his attempt to conduct controlled experiments on their linguistic abilities. When he tried to maintain scientific objectivity, the children systematically dismantled his professional detachment by describing his own childhood experiences with academic failure, his father's disappointment in his intellectual capabilities, and his lifelong fear that his scholarly achievements were elaborate compensation for fundamental inadequacy. "They don't just speak dead languages," Hartwell wrote in his final report. "They speak the dead language of human innocence, the words we all once knew before experience taught us to hide our true selves behind acceptable facades. They communicate with the children we once were, the parts of ourselves we've learned to silence in order to function as adults." The children's ability to access these buried aspects of human consciousness meant that extended contact with them produced profound psychological effects on adult visitors. People who came to study them found themselves remembering childhood experiences they had forgotten, reconnecting with parts of their personalities that had been suppressed through socialization, experiencing emotions they hadn't felt since before. They learned that vulnerability was dangerous. Some visitors found this reconnection healing. Reverend Thornfield discovered that conversations with the children restored his genuine faith after years of performing religious duties out of habit rather than conviction. Dr. Morse reconnected with the sense of wonder that had originally drawn him to medicine before bureaucracy and politics had made his practice feel like an exercise in profit management. But other visitors found the experience traumatic. Judge Cornelius Blackwood, Dr. Blackwood's brother, suffered a complete mental breakdown after the children forced him to confront the innocent boy he had been, before a lifetime of legal compromise had transformed him into someone who could send innocent men to their deaths for political convenience. What happens when the barrier between adult consciousness and childhood innocence is permanently dissolved? The answer would prove that some psychological boundaries exist to protect human sanity, and that removing them could result in forms of madness that no medical intervention could address. The winter of 1852 brought changes that would transform the Holloway children from local curiosity into something approaching mythical status throughout the Georgia mountains. As word spread about children who spoke in ancient tongues and possessed impossible knowledge, pilgrims began arriving from across the South, seeking everything from scholarly enlightenment to spiritual revelation to supernatural healing. The children responded to this attention in ways that revealed additional disturbing aspects of their nature. They could manifest simultaneously in multiple locations, appearing to different visitors at the same time while maintaining completely separate conversations. They demonstrated awareness of events occurring hundreds of miles away, describing in real-time detail what was happening to people they had never met in places they had never visited. Most unsettling was their ability to alter their apparent age and even their physical appearance based on the psychological needs of their visitors. Children who had lost parents saw them as older siblings offering comfort and protection. Adults struggling with guilt saw them as younger innocents offering forgiveness and absolution. Elderly visitors saw them as grandchildren carrying forward family legacies that seemed destined to die with the current generation. But this adaptability came with costs that became apparent as spring arrived in 1853. Visitors who spent extended periods with the children began losing their ability to function in normal society. They became obsessed with recapturing the innocence and wonder they experienced during their encounters, unable to tolerate the compromises and disappointments that defined adult life. Thomas Ashford, a businessman from Savannah who had come seeking spiritual renewal, abandoned his family and business to build a cabin near the Holloway homestead, spending his days in conversation with the children about philosophical questions that had no practical answers. Margaret Thornfield, the Reverend's wife, stopped maintaining her household responsibilities, instead devoting her time to learning the ancient languages the children spoke, convinced that these tongues held keys to spiritual truths that Christianity had forgotten. Dr. Blackwood documented at least 12 cases of visitors who never returned to their previous lives after encountering the children, instead establishing permanent residence near the Holloway property where they could maintain daily contact with entities that offered them psychological experiences unavailable in conventional reality. The children provide access to states of consciousness that human beings are apparently not designed to sustain indefinitely, Blackwood observed. Extended contact produces a form of psychological addiction where normal life becomes intolerable, compared to the heightened awareness and emotional intensity of interacting with these entities. But the most disturbing development came when the children began demonstrating knowledge of future events. They warned Mrs. Fairfax about a carriage accident that would claim her husband's life 3 weeks before it occurred. They described in detail a fire that would destroy half of Gainesville 2 months before it started. They provided specific information about a Cherokee uprising that wouldn't take place for another year, including names of participants and exact casualty figures. Their prophecies proved accurate in every detail, suggesting that their access to information extended beyond the memories of past civilizations to include knowledge of events that had not yet occurred. This temporal awareness transformed them from curiosities into something approaching oracles, attracting visitors who sought advance warning about everything from business investments to military campaigns to personal tragedies. The responsibility of possessing knowledge about future disasters created moral dilemmas that would challenge Jeremiah's understanding of human responsibility. Should he warn people about tragedies they couldn't prevent? Could changing the future based on the children's prophecies create even worse consequences? Did he have the right to burden people with knowledge about sufferings they would have to endure regardless of advance warning? These questions became urgent when the children revealed their most specific and disturbing prophecy. The exact date and circumstances of Jeremiah's own death, information that would force him to confront whether free will existed when the future could be predicted with supernatural accuracy. What would you do if you knew the precise moment and method of your own death? And if changing your behavior based on that knowledge might prevent your death, but doom others to suffer the consequences of alterations to fate's intended pattern? The children's prophecy would test everything Jeremiah believed about destiny, choice, and the responsibility that comes with possessing knowledge that no human being should have. Spring brought visitors who would transform the isolated Holloway homestead into the center of events that would challenge the stability of the entire region. Word of children who could predict the future with supernatural accuracy had reached government officials, military leaders, and business interests who saw strategic value in accessing information about events before they occurred. Colonel Marcus Whitfield arrived from the War Department with orders to determine whether the children's abilities could be utilized for military intelligence purposes. Governor Howell Cobb sent representatives to investigate whether their prophecies about political developments could provide advantages in upcoming elections. Railroad executives came seeking information about optimal routes through mountain passes, while plantation owners wanted advance warning about slave rebellions or changes in federal policy that might affect their operations. The children responded to these official visitors with information that was accurate but catastrophic in its implications. They provided detailed descriptions of a war that would begin in 9 years, involving every state in the Union and resulting in casualties that exceeded the combined population of most existing cities. They described technological innovations that would transform warfare, communication, and transportation in ways that seemed impossible given current scientific understanding. Most disturbing were their predictions about the specific fates of individual visitors. They told Colonel Whitfield exactly when and where he would die during the Battle of Antietam, describing his final thoughts and the letter he would try to write to his wife with fingers that no longer functioned. They informed Governor Cobb's representative about the political scandal that would destroy his career in 1857, providing names, dates, and details about corruption that hadn't yet occurred, but would be documented with perfect accuracy when it eventually unfolded. "They speak of the future as if it has already happened," wrote Colonel Whitfield in his classified report to Washington. "Their knowledge appears to encompass not just major events, but intimate personal details about individual experiences during those events." They describe conversations that will take place years from now, including exact quotations that participants haven't yet spoken. The military implications of such detailed foreknowledge prompted the War Department to establish a permanent observation post near the Holloway homestead, staffed by intelligence officers whose mission was to document and verify the children's predictions while exploring methods for utilizing their abilities strategically. But the children's prophecies came with warnings that made their information as dangerous as it was valuable. They explained that future events existed in states of probability rather than certainty, and that attempts to change predicted outcomes could create cascade effects that made alternative futures even worse than the original prophecies. "Time flows like water," explained the child in gray during one of her conversations with military investigators. "Damming the stream in one location causes flooding elsewhere. The war you seek to prevent will occur regardless of advance preparation. But preparation based on our knowledge will make it longer, bloodier, and more destructive to both sides." This paradox created impossible ethical dilemmas for officials who possessed advance warning about disasters they couldn't prevent without causing worse disasters. Knowing that specific battles would occur didn't help if preparing for those battles would result in even greater casualties. Understanding political developments didn't provide advantages if acting on that understanding would create worse political outcomes. Dr. Blackwood's research into the philosophical implications of prophetic knowledge revealed additional layers of complexity that challenged fundamental assumptions about human agency and moral responsibility. If the future could be predicted with perfect accuracy, did free will exist? If changing behavior based on prophetic knowledge altered the predicted outcomes, were the original predictions false, or was free will an illusion that operated within parameters too complex for human understanding? The children force us to confront questions that human philosophy has debated for millennia, Blackwood wrote. But unlike philosophical debates that remain theoretical, their prophecies provide empirical evidence about the nature of time, causation, and human choice that challenges our most basic assumptions about reality itself. The most disturbing aspect of the children's temporal knowledge was their understanding of their own nature and limitations. They explained that their existence was temporary, tied to Jeremiah's psychological needs and the specific conditions that had brought them into manifestation. They knew exactly when their time would end and what would trigger their disappearance from the physical world. We exist because Father's love created space for us in reality, the child in white explained. But love changes, grief heals, and psychological needs evolve. When Father no longer needs us to be real, we will return to the realm of possibilities, where unborn children wait for their chance to exist. This revelation meant that every interaction with the children occurred under the shadow of their eventual non-existence, adding poignancy to relationships that were already complicated by their supernatural nature. Visitors who had formed emotional attachments to entities that would inevitably vanish found themselves grieving for losses that hadn't yet occurred, but were absolutely certain to happen. The children's knowledge of their own temporary nature also meant they could predict exactly what would trigger their disappearance, the moment when Jeremiah would finally accept that his original family was gone and that holding on to supernatural substitutes was preventing him from building genuine connections with living people. That moment was approaching faster than anyone realized, set in motion by events the children had foreseen but were powerless to prevent, beginning with the arrival of a woman whose presence would force Jeremiah to choose between his phantom family and the possibility of real love with someone who actually existed in the physical world. Her name was Catherine Mackenzie, and her arrival at the Holloway homestead on April 15, 1853, marked the beginning of the end for children who had never been born, but had somehow learned to exist through the power of parental love that refused to accept the finality of death. The morning mist clung to Catherine Mackenzie like a wedding veil as she rode up the mountain path that led to the Holloway homestead, her horse's hooves clicking against stone with the steady rhythm of inevitability. The smell of dogwood blossoms mixed with the earthy scent of rich mountain soil, while sunlight filtered through new spring leaves that cast dancing shadows on ground that had been frozen for months. This was the moment when the impossible balance between grief and hope that sustained the Holloway children would finally shift toward resolution. Catherine had come seeking the children for reasons that were both practical and deeply personal. Her younger brother, Samuel, had been missing for 3 months after disappearing during a hunting trip in the mountains near their family farm. Search parties had found no trace of him, and local authorities had given up the investigation, assuming he had fallen into a ravine or been killed by wild animals. But Catherine refused to accept that Samuel was dead without proof, and reports of children who could see past and future events offered the possibility of learning what had actually happened to her brother. The first glimpse of the Holloway children confirmed everything Catherine had heard about their otherworldly nature. They sat in Jeremiah's yard as if they had been expecting her arrival, dressed in their signature white, gray, and black dresses that never seemed to accumulate dirt or show signs of normal wear. Their golden hair caught the morning sunlight with an intensity that seemed to generate its own illumination, and their eyes held depths that belonged to beings who had experienced far more than their apparent age would suggest. But Catherine's reaction to the children differed from that of previous visitors in ways that immediately caught their attention. She showed no fear, no awe, no desperate need for spiritual revelation or supernatural healing. Instead, she approached them with the straightforward manner of someone accustomed to dealing with practical problems that required practical solutions. "I'm Catherine Mackenzie," she said, dismounting from her horse with fluid grace that spoke of years spent riding mountain trails. "I've come asking about my brother Samuel. People say you can see things that others cannot. I need to know what happened to him." The children exchanged glances that seemed to communicate volumes without words. For the first time since their manifestation, they appeared uncertain, as if Catherine's presence introduced variables they hadn't anticipated. The child in white spoke first, her voice carrying less authority than usual. "We see many things, Miss Mackenzie, but some knowledge comes with prices that must be considered carefully before payment is made." Catherine's response revealed the strength of character that would prove more challenging to the children than any scholarly investigation or military interrogation they had previously encountered. "I've already paid every price that matters. When I lost my brother, whatever truth you can offer can't be worse than not knowing." The child in gray stood slowly, her expression grave with the weight of information that would change Catherine's life permanently. "Your brother Samuel is alive, but he is not the person you remember. The mountains have claimed him in ways that make death seem merciful by comparison." What followed was a revelation that would test Catherine's courage more severely than any physical danger she had ever faced. The children described Samuel's current condition with clinical precision that made their words even more horrifying than euphemistic explanations would have been. Samuel had indeed fallen into a ravine, but he had survived the fall with injuries that left him unable to climb out or call for help. He had been discovered by a family of Cherokee outcasts who had been living in hidden caves since their people's forced removal, surviving by avoiding all contact with white settlers and developing their own methods for dealing with intruders who accidentally discovered their location. "They do not kill outsiders who stumble into their territory," explained the child in black. "Death creates bodies that might be found and investigations that could expose their hiding places. Instead, they ensure that intruders can never leave and never reveal what they have seen." The methods used to accomplish this permanent isolation involved systematic breaking of leg bones to prevent escape, removal of tongue to prevent communication, and careful tending that kept victims alive indefinitely while ensuring they could never pose a threat to the group's security. Samuel had been maintained in this condition for 3 months, fed enough to survive but kept in circumstances that made death impossible and rescue equally unlikely. Catherine absorbed this information with composure that impressed even the children. She didn't weep, didn't rage, didn't collapse under the weight of learning that her brother's fate was worse than death. Instead, she began asking practical questions about location, accessibility, and the possibility of mounting a rescue operation that could succeed without getting more people killed or captured. "You're not like the others who come here," observed the child in white. "You don't seek comfort from us. You don't need us to validate your faith or provide meaning for your existence. You simply want information that will allow you to take action." Catherine's response revealed the fundamental difference between her and previous visitors that would prove so threatening to the children's continued existence. "I have real problems that require real solutions. Whatever you are, you're not real in ways that can help me save my brother. You might provide information, but you can't provide the physical strength, practical skills, and genuine human connections I'll need to mount a rescue operation." This distinction between supernatural knowledge and practical capability introduced concepts that challenged the children's understanding of their own value and purpose. Previous visitors had treated them as sources of ultimate wisdom, entities whose otherworldly nature made them superior to ordinary human relationships. Catherine saw them as potentially useful informants whose supernatural characteristics were interesting but irrelevant to solving actual problems that existed in the physical world. Her presence also affected Jeremiah in ways that the children found deeply disturbing. For the first time since their manifestation, he began paying more attention to a living person than to his phantom family. Catherine's combination of intelligence, determination, and genuine need for assistance awakened protective instincts that had been dormant since his wife's death, reminding him of the satisfactions that came from helping real people solve real problems. The children watched this development with growing alarm. They understood that Catherine represented everything they could never become: a living woman who could form genuine relationships, bear actual children, and share a future that extended beyond the boundaries of supernatural manifestation. Her presence forced Jeremiah to confront the difference between loving phantoms who existed to fulfill his emotional needs and loving a real person who had her own needs, desires, and independent existence. "She threatens everything we are," the child in gray admitted during one of their private conversations. "Father created us to replace what he had lost, to be perfect children who could never disappoint him or die before their time. But she makes him want things we cannot provide: partnership with an equal, the possibility of new family, connection with someone who exists independently of his psychological needs." The child in black added the observation that would prove prophetic: "If Father chooses her over us, we will cease to exist. Not gradually, not partially, but completely and permanently. Our reality depends entirely on his need for us to be real. The moment he no longer needs phantom children, we will return to the realm of unrealized possibilities from which we came." This created a conflict between the children's desire to help Catherine rescue her brother and their need to preserve their own existence. Providing the information she needed would likely result in a successful rescue operation that would demonstrate the superiority of practical action over supernatural knowledge. Success would strengthen Catherine's bond with Jeremiah while weakening his psychological dependence on phantom children who existed primarily to fulfill his unfulfilled parental instincts. But refusing to help would contradict everything they had learned about the nature of love, sacrifice, and moral responsibility during their conversations with visitors who had sought guidance about ethical dilemmas. They couldn't claim to represent spiritual wisdom while refusing to help rescue an innocent person who was suffering through no fault of his own. The resolution of this dilemma would determine not just Samuel Mackenzie's fate, but the future existence of children who had learned to love the Father whose grief had called them into being, even though that love would ultimately require them to sacrifice their own reality for his chance at genuine happiness. What would you choose if helping someone you loved meant ensuring your own destruction? The question that would define the final chapter of the Holloway children's impossible existence, beginning with their decision to provide Catherine with information that would save her brother but doom them to return to the realm of unborn possibilities, where love exists only as potential rather than actuality. The rescue expedition departed on May 1, 1853, led by Catherine Mackenzie with assistance from Jeremiah and 12 volunteers from the surrounding mountain communities. The children had provided detailed maps of the hidden Cherokee stronghold, including information about guard positions, escape routes, and the precise location where Samuel was being held. Their supernatural knowledge had made possible a mission that would have been suicide without advance intelligence about every aspect of the target location. But the children's most valuable contribution wasn't their prophetic abilities. It was their decision to manifest physically during the rescue operation, using their supernatural nature to create distractions and confusion that allowed the human rescuers to approach undetected. For the first time since their appearance, they acted directly in the physical world rather than simply providing information about it. The child in white appeared to the Cherokee sentries as a lost spirit that needed to be guided back to the realm of the dead, drawing them away from their posts. The child in gray manifested inside the cave system, creating sounds and lights that suggested supernatural activity requiring immediate spiritual attention. The child in black remained with the rescue party, providing real-time information about changing conditions and unexpected obstacles. Their coordinated efforts enabled a rescue operation that succeeded with no casualties among either the rescuers or the Cherokee defenders. Samuel was extracted from his imprisonment and transported to safety before his captors realized that supernatural entities had been working in coordination with human forces to achieve an outcome that conventional tactics could never have accomplished. But the success of the rescue mission came with consequences that the children had foreseen but accepted as the price of doing what they knew was right. Their direct involvement in physical events had required them to expend energy that they couldn't regenerate, burning through the psychological substance that maintained their manifestation. More significantly, their successful coordination with human rescuers demonstrated to Jeremiah that supernatural entities could work with living people rather than replacing them, opening possibilities for relationships that combined otherworldly wisdom with earthly practicality. The days following Samuel's rescue marked the beginning of changes that would transform the entire dynamic of life at the Holloway homestead. Catherine remained to help with her brother's recovery, but her presence served purposes beyond medical care. She and Jeremiah discovered compatibility that went far beyond their shared commitment to rescuing Samuel, finding in each other the kind of partnership that neither had experienced with previous relationships. Catherine understood and accepted Jeremiah's history with the supernatural children without demanding that he explain or justify their existence. She saw them as part of his healing process from previous tragedy, entities that had served important purposes but were no longer necessary now that he was ready to engage with living people who could offer genuine reciprocal relationships. Jeremiah found in Catherine someone who appreciated his practical skills, intellectual curiosity, and capacity for loyalty, without requiring him to fulfill impossible emotional needs or maintain supernatural connections that drained his energy. She represented the possibility of building something new, rather than trying to reconstruct what had been lost, of creating a future, rather than remaining trapped in grief about the past. The children observed these developments with emotions that combined joy for Jeremiah's happiness with sorrow about their own approaching non-existence. They had learned to love their phantom father genuinely, but that love included wanting what was best for him, even when his best interests conflicted with their continued reality. "We succeeded in our purpose," the child in white observed during one of their final conversations. "We kept Father alive during the period when grief might have destroyed him. We provided him with love and purpose when he had nothing else to sustain him. We helped him remember how to care about other people's welfare. Now he's ready for relationships with living people who can offer him things we never could." The child in gray added her own reflection on their temporary existence. "We were never meant to be permanent. We were a bridge between Father's lost family and his future family, entities whose purpose was to maintain connection until he was ready to love again. That bridge has served its function. Now it must be removed so that genuine construction can begin." The child in black provided the final perspective that would define their departure from physical existence. "We learned what love means by loving Father, even though we knew that love would eventually require us to sacrifice our reality for his happiness. That knowledge will remain part of the universe even after we cease to exist as individual entities. Love that sacrifices itself for others becomes eternal in ways that selfish love never can." Their gradual fading began in June 1853, as Jeremiah's emotional investment shifted from phantom children to his growing relationship with Catherine. The process occurred slowly enough that visitors could observe the stages through which supernatural manifestations dissolved when the psychological conditions that sustained them changed. First, the children lost their ability to manifest simultaneously in multiple locations, their supernatural power concentrating into single appearances that lasted for shorter periods each day. Then their knowledge of distant events faded, their prophetic abilities diminishing as their connection to otherworldly information sources weakened. Finally, their physical manifestation became translucent. Their voices grew faint, and their presence in the world reduced to brief appearances that occurred primarily during twilight hours, when the boundary between reality and possibility was most permeable. Dr. Blackwood documented their final weeks with scientific precision that couldn't conceal his emotional investment in entities he had come to regard as genuine friends rather than research subjects. They faced non-existence with courage that would be admirable in adults and seems miraculous in beings who appear to be children, he wrote. They have learned to love unselfishly, to sacrifice completely, and to find meaning in temporary existence that serves purposes larger than individual survival. Their last appearance occurred on the evening of July 4, 1853, when Jeremiah and Catherine announced their engagement to be married. The children materialized in the yard where they had first appeared 9 months earlier, but now they were barely visible even in the dimming light, their voices so faint that their words seemed to come from a great distance. "We are happy for you, Father," the child in white whispered. "We are proud to have served as your family during the time when you needed us to exist. Remember us not as phantoms who held you back," added the child in gray, "but as love that found a way to manifest when manifestation was necessary for survival." The child in black spoke the final words that any living person would hear from the Holloway children. We return now to the realm of possibilities, where unborn children wait for chances to exist, and love waits for opportunities to take form. Thank you for giving us the gift of reality, however temporary that reality proved to be. They faded into the summer evening like mist touched by sunlight, their forms dissolving gradually, until only the memory of their presence remained. But that memory would prove more lasting than their physical manifestation, influencing everyone who had encountered them to understand love, sacrifice, and the nature of family in ways that would shape their relationships for the remainder of their lives. Jeremiah and Catherine were married on September 15, 1853, in a ceremony that honored both their future together and the phantom children whose love had made that future possible. Over the following years, they raised 5 living children who grew up hearing stories about the supernatural siblings who had existed briefly, but had loved completely, learning from those stories that family bonds transcend the boundaries between physical and spiritual existence. Samuel Mackenzie recovered fully from his ordeal and went on to establish himself as a physician whose understanding of human resilience had been shaped by his experience of surviving impossible circumstances through the combined efforts of supernatural entities and human determination. He never married, claiming that his encounter with beings who existed purely through love had set standards for relationships that earthly romance could never match. Dr. Blackwood continued his research into supernatural manifestations for the remainder of his career, but never encountered entities that matched the complexity and moral sophistication of the Holloway children. His published accounts of their existence became foundational texts for researchers studying the intersection between psychology and paranormal phenomena, establishing frameworks for understanding how human emotional needs could create bridges between possible and actual existence. The homestead itself remained in the Holloway family for 3 generations, with each set of residents reporting occasional glimpses of children playing in the yard during twilight hours. But these later manifestations were recognized as echoes, rather than genuine appearances, shadows of love that had once been strong enough to create its own reality, but had willingly sacrificed that reality for the good of others. Local folklore preserved the story of the Holloway Triplets with accuracy that surprised scholars who studied mountain oral traditions. Unlike most supernatural tales that grew more fantastic with each telling, the account of children who spoke dead languages and sacrificed their existence for their father's happiness remained remarkably consistent across decades of retelling, as if the truth of their story was too powerful to be distorted by normal processes of mythological evolution. The Cherokee family that had held Samuel Mackenzie eventually established peaceful contact with white settlers, using the rescue operation as evidence that cooperation between different peoples could produce better outcomes than conflict. Their decision to emerge from hiding led to the establishment of one of the first integrated communities in northern Georgia, where Cherokee and European agricultural techniques combined to create farming methods that were more productive than either approach used separately. Government officials, who had sought to exploit the children's prophetic abilities for military and political advantage, found that their documented predictions about future events proved accurate in every detail, even though the children were no longer available to provide additional information. The War Department's classified files on the Holloway children became source material for strategic planning that influenced American military policy through the Civil War and beyond. though the supernatural origin of this intelligence was never acknowledged in official records. The railroad companies that had consulted the children about optimal routes through mountain passes discovered that following their recommendations resulted in construction projects that were completed ahead of schedule and under budget, with fewer engineering problems and environmental obstacles than conventional surveying would have anticipated. Several major rail lines through the Appalachian region were built according to routes that supernatural entities had mapped with precision that exceeded contemporary technical capabilities. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Holloway children was their demonstration that love could create its own reality, when that reality served purposes larger than individual satisfaction. Their temporary existence proved that the boundary between possible and actual could be crossed when sufficient emotional energy was focused on needs that transcended selfish desires. What would the world become if more people understood that love willing to sacrifice itself creates forms of reality that purely selfish emotions cannot achieve? The question that the Holloway children's brief existence poses to every generation that learns their story, challenging assumptions about the nature of family, the meaning of existence, and the power of love that places others' needs above its own survival. Even today, visitors to the site of the original Holloway homestead report hearing children's laughter echoing through the Georgia mountains, and the sound carries syllables that belong to languages that died out centuries before any living person was born. Linguistic researchers who have studied recordings of these voices confirm that they speak in dialects that match scholarly reconstructions of Proto-Indo-European, as if the children's gift for ancient languages continues to manifest even though the entities themselves have returned to the realm of unborn possibilities. The lesson of the Holloway Triplets reminds us that some families transcend the boundaries between life and death. Some love proves stronger than the limitations of physical existence, and some sacrifices create forms of immortality that no selfish preservation of individual reality could ever achieve. They existed because they were needed, loved because love was required, and disappeared because their love was strong enough to choose their Father's happiness over their own continued existence. In a world where supernatural phenomena often serve to frighten or mystify, the Holloway children demonstrated that otherworldly manifestations could embody the highest human virtues while challenging living people to understand love, family, and sacrifice in ways that transform how they approach their own relationships with both the living and the dead. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.